Part 1 mapped the deadlock. The Palestinians refuse to give up their claim to the entirety of the land, and in turn, Israel will not trade land for peace. Left alone, the two sides cannot reach partition. Part 2 mapped the cost to the United States. The conflict taxes American interests abroad and American politics at home, and it blocks a major strategic prize, a united regional bloc against Iran. It is ultimately in America's interest to try and resolve it. This part is about the players, because despite its power and influence, the United States cannot end this conflict on its own. While the U.S. can press Israel hard, it simply does not have the same direct leverage over the Palestinians. And it most certainly cannot give a Palestinian leader the most important thing he needs before he can sign a finalized agreement: cover. Only the Saudis and the rest of the Arab states can provide that. If they back a deal openly, the Palestinian leader who signs it is following their lead, not betraying his own people. That is what makes giving up their claims something he can survive, instead of something that gets him killed. They also possess certain levers over the Palestinians, and can pull them to provide pressure if needed. Ultimately, a resolution will take an entire coalition, each member using the pieces of influence it holds. There are also some actors who benefit from this conflict, and will work to wreck any deal. Any plan will have to manage them from the start, not deal with them at the end. So let's map the board. I'm leaving out the players with no real leverage or reason to block a settlement. We're only looking at the actors who are pivotal to making this hold, and the ones with the incentives to wreck it. Each of them has their own stake, and the plan that follows is built entirely around these realities. Start with the two parties. Israel first. If the Palestinians give up their claim, for good and credibly, then the existential threat their claim poses, Israel's status as a Jewish state, is neutralized. The fear that made the security voter the median voter is broken. And with it gone, the impulse that once backed Oslo and the Gaza withdrawal can reassert itself. They are further incentivized with a real prize: normalization with the Arab and Muslim world, Saudi Arabia at the head of it, and the formal bloc against Iran. And as we discussed in Part 2, the conflict is the main thing blocking it. But getting the Palestinians to renounce their claim is only half the battle. For Israelis, it solves the existential fear, but there is still a hard wall inside Israeli politics. You still have to overcome the settler movement, the deep-seated religious and national claim to the West Bank that is entrenched within a portion of the Israeli population. And it is the hardest part of delivering a deal on the Israeli side. There's also another problem. Israel will not move on a promise. The renunciation of Palestinian claims it trades the land for has to be real and irreversible. That is a firm condition, and the design of any settlement has to meet it. And after October 7th, the psychological bar sits higher than ever. The lesson a large part of the Israeli public took from that day is that withdrawal gets them massacred. The proof demanded of the other side is far steeper now than it was in the 1990s and 2000s. Now let's talk about the Palestinians. Their interest is self-determination, and a state, an end to the occupation, and the realization of their historic claim, control of all the land, with the right of return as its individual form. As we discussed in Part 1, the maximal project cannot be won. The power gap is overwhelmingly decisive, and only widening. And violence in service of maximal goals ultimately buys nothing but worse terms or never-ending war. A legitimate state in the West Bank and Gaza is the only real gain left on the table. It is sovereignty. It ends occupation. It delivers the dignity of self-rule. And out of inherited refugee status, a normal national life. What stands in their way is a renunciation. And it is the hardest single concession in the whole settlement. Giving up their core claim and the right of return is not handing over a bargaining chip. As Part 1 put it, it is foundational, bound up with their national existence. To give it up is to give up something existential to who they are. And for any leader, it is also a question of survival. Who renounces the right of return and lives? The rejectionist core, Hamas and others, will not accept it at any price. For Hamas, that refusal is intertwined with their doctrine, held until Judgment Day. But beyond the rejectionists, there is another massive hurdle to overcome. There is no Palestinian leadership with enough legitimacy to issue the renunciation and make it stick. The Palestinian Authority holds pockets of the West Bank. Gaza is under Hamas. The rivals are not a government, and Hamas would likely win any vote held today. Everything that follows in this plan assumes a counterparty that does not exist yet, and it cannot be wished into being. It has to be built, and building it is critical for any plan to work. Now, the absence of a unified governing authority is not only an internal Palestinian failure. It is actively kept that way. Rejectionist patrons fund and shelter this division. International institutions and organizations built on the conflict depend on it. And Israeli governments have at times found the divided Palestinian side useful. Because as long as there is no unified partner, there is no pressure to negotiate a final deal. So this split is, in part, manufactured, which means part of the plan has to be mitigating and marginalizing the forces that prop it up. Those are the two primary actors. Now we get to the coalition, the outside leverage. It runs on 4 players, each bringing a different kind of weight to the table. The United States has a strong interest to help bring about an end to this conflict. And it is the one actor with real leverage, not only over Israel, but many of the other players as well. Its payoff for a settlement was discussed in detail in Part 2. Saudi-Israel normalization, the bloc against Iran, a lighter footprint in the region, diminished Chinese influence, the international and domestic legitimacy tax lifted. The catch is domestic politics. Pressuring Israel on the scale that may be required to bring about peace could be politically toxic in Washington. The pro-Israel constituency in American politics is powerful, and its influence is significant, despite the changing political calculus. It would also take enormous political capital and sustain presidential attention, spent on a hard, slow problem whose payoff may not arrive on any one president's watch. Despite the benefits, inaction is the path of least resistance. It is usually the path taken. Now Saudi Arabia. They want regional stability and to check on Iran's ambitions. And they supply something no one else can: Arab and Islamic legitimacy. The Saudi king is the custodian of the 2 holy mosques, de facto leader of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and a powerful force in the Arab League. Their support gives a Palestinian leader the ability to sign a renunciation, without their population and the rest of the Arab world seeing it as surrender and a betrayal. For many Palestinians, the claim is held as faith, and a faith objection is best answered by religious authority. That is what the custodian's blessing is. It is also what marginalizes Hamas's claim that the fight is a religious duty. No secular power can supply it, which is exactly why any remotely realistic plan needs Saudi support. It is the one that never came for Arafat. And the Saudi incentive to support this initiative is significant. A formal anti-Iran bloc which would strengthen their security position in the region. The Palestinian issue that acts as an open wound to their own legitimacy would finally be diffused. And a deeper American relationship, including a defense treaty and a civil nuclear program. But despite the obvious benefits, the Saudis are highly risk-averse. They will not burn their own political capital on a plan that may leave them exposed, especially when it pushes up against their own domestic constraints. Their own public is very much bound to the Palestinian cause. Even an authoritarian state like the Saudi Kingdom has to mind the attitudes of their domestic populace. They cannot normalize relations with Israel unless they are able to tell their public that a credible, irreversible pathway will be created towards the foundation of a Palestinian state. And even with this assurance, there would still be significant opposition. This is not a posture. It is reality. And it has hardened since Gaza. While Saudi cover makes acceptance possible for the Palestinians, the Saudis need cover too. Without it, they stay out. Europe, meanwhile, is a necessary piece of the coalition. They provide the majority of the aid, including acting as the primary financial floor under UNRWA. Their backing gives the process international legitimacy and supplies some of the capital required to actually execute the transition. Their payoff is simple. Calm in their near abroad, and an end to the conflict could mitigate some of the instability fracturing their own domestic politics. But Europe is not a unified national bloc. And despite its aid contribution, its hard leverage is thin. Its tendency is to reach for a symbolic gesture or a statement over a harder lever. Finally, we get to the international institutions. The UN and the Security Council supply one primary thing: legitimacy. The framework stamped international, rather than just American. But there is a limit on what they can actually deliver. They can confer legitimacy. They cannot compel outcomes. The Security Council is also hostage to the great power veto, which leads us to some other players that matter to the process. They are not one bloc, and how they matter is singular. Will they be a hindrance? Most ultimately won't. Some I suspect will actually help. But one pair most certainly will be a roadblock. There are three categories. First, the two regional players who currently exploit the conflict but have no real need for it to continue. The co-optable holdouts, Qatar and Turkey. Second, the great power rivals, Russia and China. They do not oppose the idea of a settlement itself, only what a settlement would cost them. These nations can be moved, brought in, pressured, or gotten past. Then the pair that cannot. These are the irreconcilables, Iran and Hamas. Their power is tied to the conflict, so a settlement is not a setback, but a defeat. Strategic for Iran, outright for Hamas. Neither leverage nor incentives will change their worldviews. They can only be contained and outlasted. Let's start with a co-optable pair, Qatar and Turkey. Both shelter and in part bankroll Hamas, and both are driven by political Islam of the Muslim Brotherhood strand, an ideology that holds Palestine not as a territorial dispute, but as a sacred and political cause at once. How this matters for our purposes is this: can a politics built on that ideology and its patronage of Hamas accept the kind of settlement we are going to propose, or at the very least not stand in the way? We need to start with what their worldview actually demands. The broader movement has accepted coexistence in practice. When the Brotherhood held power in Egypt, it upheld the treaty with Israel, rather than tear it up. Qatar and Turkey have done the same. Qatar funded Gaza for years in coordination with Israel, and Erdogan has restored ties with Israel twice after rupturing them. The ideology can accept two states, and this plan delivers one. And although a settlement does not give everything the ideology wants, there is a piece it will not get, which the plan will come to. It gets enough. And with religious cover, a leader with standing can carry it to their public as the cause advanced, not the cause abandoned. So their ideology is no barrier. And ultimately, the patronage is no barrier either. They fund Hamas out of brotherhood kinship and as a lever of standing in the region, not a shared aim in its war on Israel. The bond is real, but it is not a bond to a never-ending war. They back Hamas because it serves them, and a settlement can be made to serve them more. Neither needs the conflict to go on to perpetuate or defend their interests. They may exploit it, but they do not need it. Strip it away, and Qatar is still a gas-rich, well-connected power broker with its hands in a dozen other regional issues. Turkey is still a large power in a crucial geographic position, with an army, a drone industry, and reach from Syria to Libya to the Caucasus. What would spark resistance is a settlement that shuts them out of the new regional order, or worse, one that diminishes their standing in it. And neither is harmless. Each holds leverage that could wound the process. Qatar is the main channel to Hamas, and a major funder of Gaza. It can keep the money flowing and Hamas dug in. Turkey can throw its weight behind the rejectionists, giving them a regional power patron and a banner to rally to. So any deal should aim to include them, and for each, inclusion takes a different form. For Qatar, it means remaining the regional broker, the role it already plays with Hamas, now flipped to ending the conflict rather than sustaining it, and remaining a major non-NATO ally of the United States. For Turkey, it means a place in the emerging alignment, not left as the one Sunni power outside the new regional order the settlement creates. With the added incentive of a Palestinian state, Erdogan can claim as a victory he in part delivered. Where Turkey's interests genuinely rub against Israel is not Palestine, but Syria and the Eastern Mediterranean, and those are separate matters, ones that can be managed on their own tracks. And whatever Erdogan and his government says about Israel, lately a great deal, it is mostly over his standing in the region, not the settlement. Qatar would be the easier of the two to co-opt. Turkey, needing the deal less, is likelier to wobble. But Erdogan, of all of them, has the standing to sell the new state as a win at home. An opposition would cost it more than acquiescence. With the major Sunni states bought in, a Turkey standing alone against the deal isn't leading the cause. It is an outlier fighting the new consensus. So Qatar and Turkey can be co-opted. Our great power rivals, Russia and China, can be as well. Now they are different in kind, and their positions need to be viewed with a wider lens. They are not ideological patrons of either party. They are veto-holding rivals at the one procedural choke point the framework and process need to give it international legitimacy. Fundamentally, both sides can back a partition and two-state settlement. It in fact fits their officially stated positions on the issue. And it plays well in the global south. The potential roadblock is not about the Palestinians or the Israelis. It is about what a peace deal would mean to them. A settlement of the conflict and the establishment of a U.S.-Israeli-Saudi bloc would consolidate American regional primacy and shut them out. So they have some incentive to deny Washington the win, to water it down, put a price on it, or actively block it. China most of all. It allows for a real American pivot to the Pacific. But to veto a settlement of one of the world's most intractable conflicts, with most of the world behind it, would leave China isolated, as the one blocking a peace deal the global South it courts wants. It is simply too high a price. It has other tools to push back on American primacy, and what it ultimately needs is the oil flowing, which a settlement protects, not threatens. Russia has less a stake in the region than it did, pushed out of Syria, offering Iran little in its hour of need. Its reason to spoil is not stakes on the ground, but relevance itself. For a power diminished elsewhere, blocking the deal is a way to prove it still matters, that Washington cannot remake the region without it. But already isolated over Ukraine, it cannot afford to be seen blocking a peace the world wants either. So Russia and China are obstacles to manage. Their leverage is real, the will to use it is not. The next pair, however, are not in that category. These are the spoilers, with the Islamic Republic of Iran as its engine. The regime's hostility to Israel is not a tactic. Israel's destruction is woven into the regime's founding ethos. And the settlement that results in an Israel-Saudi-American bloc is a hammer blow to Iran's position in the region. So the regime will work to wreck it, through its regional proxies and through avenues we won't anticipate. Its opposition is structural, and it represents potentially one of the hardest challenges towards achieving a settlement. With Iran, the real problem is military, not diplomatic. The war did degrade the regime's capabilities, but it retained significant strength and the reach to use it. It can light fires across the region to blow the process apart, unleashing its proxies on Israel, striking the Gulf states to frighten Riyadh off, threatening the shipping lanes. The challenge is not persuading the regime. It is deterring and containing what it can do to break the framework. And then there is Hamas. Hamas survives in its current form only while the conflict continues, which makes the settlement a matter of life and death for it, in the most literal sense. And despite the war in Gaza, it remains a spoiler on the ground, and it will launch attacks to derail the process. Bait an Israeli overreaction, knock Israel off the settlement, break the coalition, and prove that nothing happens without Hamas's consent. That is the full set of players. Who sits where, what each one wants, and what each can do to wreck this. That is the board. What gets built on it is the final part.